Hello, I'm Karen Sheehy and I am doing a voiceover for the Practice Supervisor Preparation. I have taken part of the workshop that we deliver face to face and pulled out the NMC Standards part, which is at the beginning. This preparation will be around about a 20-minute listen or so. The aim of the session is to really inform you about the NMC standards for education and training, and in particular the relevant part 2, which relates to practice supervision. There are quite a few practice aims and outcomes here that relate to the standards, but essentially what you need to know is that the university has worked in partnership with the practice learning partners, the main organisations that we place students with, to develop the materials for the preparation, and they are used across the trusts and at Oxford Brookes. The NMC introduced the new standards in 2018. They introduced different standards for the programmes and new standards for supervision and assessment at the same time. At the moment, we have new standards for programmes for nursing associates, nursing, midwifery, prescribing and return to practice. These standards operate from when the programme was approved for and when the university is going to say that they will start. So, for example, nursing students at the moment are currently on the 2010 Nursing Midwifery Council standards that set their proficiencies for those programmes, and they will continue to run out until the end of their delivery. But what the NMC have said is you need to have a new programme in place, and that has to start at the end of August 2020. I think a few universities, though, have been delayed because of the COVID-19 crisis, and some universities won't go until 2021. These are exceptions. Oxford Brookes will be introducing a new nursing programme from September 2020. The same goes for nursing associates and midwifery and prescribing and return to practice next year. So health visiting, community specialist practice programme will come in 2021-22 when those standards are released. You're probably thinking, what has this got to do with me? As a practice supervisor, you need to be aware then that you could have students on different programme standards that you are supervising. You need to know which programme the student is on because this relates to their proficiencies and competencies in practice. So there may be a difference in those proficiencies and competencies that you are supervising and assessing them against. So academic education institutions, the universities, have transition arrangements in place, and those transition arrangements may alter depending on what the university is that the student comes from. Alongside the programme standards changing, the new standards for supervision and assessment were introduced. Oxford Brookes went for changes to their new standards for supervision and assessment in September 2019. So all students have been transitioned over to the new supervision and assessment standards, regardless of their programme standards. The new standards for supervision and assessment introduced these 3 new roles: practice supervisor, practice assessor and academic assessor. One of the activities that is on the supervisor preparation asks you to go to the NMC website to look at the materials that the NMC have produced regarding the student supervision and assessment standards. They are very, very good. So what are the principles of the Standards for Student Supervision and Assessment? This gets abbreviated nationally to the SSSA. Separate supervision and assessment roles were introduced in an attempt to increase consistency in assessment judgments. Under the previous mentor standards, there was one mentor for one student, and the mentor made the assessment judgments really based on their own. And part of the issue that the NMC in their review discovered was that sometimes mentors weren't willing to make a decision to fail a student because they were doing it mainly on their own and with very little evidence to support that decision. Improving interprofessional working would be a great aim, because what they wanted to do was to see if other professionals could input into that assessment decision with the student. And part of the revision of the standards has allowed practice supervisors to be any health or social care registrant, and I will go over that later. So joint working between academic education institutions and practice placement partners, mainly larger organisations and voluntary and independent sector placements, were needing to be improved. The NMC said that there was too much differentiation between some universities had excellent partnerships and some universities did not have very good partnerships. So the standards are also an attempt to improve that joint working. And as I've said before, Oxford Brookes have worked in very good partnership with the organisations to produce the materials and maintain a consistency in the quality of the standards as we go forward. Supporting students becomes every NMC registrant's responsibility. It's in the code already though, but by making all registrants practice supervisors, in a way that's saying you don't really have a choice, everybody has to support students. So therefore, everyone will have an input into assessment now. As a registrant, it will be your responsibility to support the students and contribute to their assessment by giving feedback to the student. All students on NMC programmes are supervised while learning in practice. This isn't a new concept. All students are already supervised while learning in practice. However, by saying that every registrant is now able to be a practice supervisor, the NMC are really explicitly saying, look, you're a practice supervisor, so therefore you are supervising students. Before, students might be saying that they weren't being supervised because their mentor wasn't there on duty at the same time. So now, with everyone being able to be a practice supervisor, it's very clear that practice supervision is taking place. The level of supervision provided to students reflects their learning needs and stage of learning. Again, this is not a new concept. It's just, if you like, bringing that forward, that really with the new competencies that are based on the new programme, they are considerable and they are requiring students to really step up and get the opportunities and the way that they need to develop their learning at appropriate stages. So, for example, if you have a first year student that has no experience of healthcare and they are on their first placement, they will need a considerably more direct showing and enabling, or in order to meet their proficiencies, than you would hope the third year would. For example, if a third year is requiring direct hands-on supervision and being shown how to do things, then there may well be an issue with their learning needs, and they may well need to be up on an action plan because they are not at that stage of their course being able to operate independently and with a degree of showing a degree of leadership. There is sufficient coordination and continuity of support and supervision of students to ensure safe and effective learning experiences. Really, if any registrant can be a practice supervisor, they are really saying that, whilst we're saying every registrant can do this, there has to be a level of coordination and continuity. So it really needs to be made clear to the student who are the practice supervisors and how are they going to communicate between the practice supervisors and the practice assessor for that placement. If a student is wandering around trying to find practice supervisors, this doesn't show a sufficient coordination and continuity of support to the student. So the students need to know who the team of practice supervisors are at the beginning of the placement, and we are strongly suggesting that you team up supervisors into maybe groups of 6 or so that they can follow a student through that placement, and the students' shifts are organised along the lines of those practice supervisors. Practice assessors do not necessarily have to work directly with the student. The standards say that they need opportunities to observe, so that everyday supporting, teaching and meeting proficiencies is based on the practice supervisor, and the practice supervisor working and developing the students' needs. All students on an NMC approved programme are supervised in practice by NMC registered nurses and midwives and other registered health and social care professionals. So any health or social care professional can contribute to student learning, supervision and assessment. Practice supervisors may supervise different students, so you don't just have to be a practice supervisor for one student on one occasion on one shift. You may be a practice supervisor for, say, 3 or 4 students, and as those students rotate through different shifts, you come across those students. But as I've said, it's really important that you look at the coordination and continuity of those practice supervisors. Each student may have several different practice supervisors, therefore, including other healthcare professionals. It's not really a new concept for a student to spoke out into other areas with other healthcare professionals. But what the standards are doing is it's making it really explicit that when a student spokes out to another healthcare professional, that other healthcare professional becomes a practice supervisor, and that will require a degree of feedback to the student on how they have got on with them. So the student, if you like, isn't going off for a nice day with, say, the physiotherapist. They're going with the physiotherapist in order to meet a proficiency or part of a proficiency, and that physiotherapist, as the practice supervisor, gives the student feedback on how they have got on with them. Practice assessors may be a practice supervisor to other students, but you can't be a practice supervisor and a practice assessor for the same student at the same time. In essence, then, this is saying that you can be a practice supervisor to one student, you can be a practice supervisor to several students, but really you can only be a practice assessor to one student or a practice assessor to several students, but you can't be a practice supervisor to those students as well. This may sound confusing, but essentially what it's doing, it's allowing a level of flexibility depending on the specific practice area. So, for example, if you're on a large ward where you have several practice assessors, several practice supervisors, as a student, yes, you may have one practice assessor and then a group of practice supervisors. But if you are going, say, to a GP surgery where you have, say, only 2 or 3 nurses, you may have one practice assessor and 2 supervisors, and then wish to spoke out to a different placement area with more practice supervisors. And those practice supervisors contact the practice assessor back at the base. Each student will be allocated a practice assessor for the placement where the summative assessment is required. Alongside the practice assessor for the placement, each student will have an academic assessor for that part of the programme. The part of a programme is generally the year in which the student is in. For example, a nursing or midwifery student in the first year will be in part 1 of the programme. If the student, however, is on a programme that is, say, 4 years in length, that may have a longer part 3, and as a practice supervisor, you need to recognise which part the student is in. Students may take a key role in their supervision and assessment in practice, and they need to be prepared and have a sound understanding of the proficiencies they need to achieve. Students will have their practice assessment document either through the electronic practice assessment document or a hard copy. And you need to be familiar with these documents as a practice supervisor in order to complete the feedback. All practice supervisors and practice assessors, if they have a student with an electronic pad, need to register and gain access to the BPAD. Students need to be aware of the person they should speak to in the practice area if they have concerns. This generally might well be somebody related to sorting out the placements in the area and the link lecturer, or it could be the practice assessor. Issues could arise though if the student is concerned about the lack of ability to have practice supervisors or practice assessors, and they need to speak to somebody else about that. Students should be actively encouraged to seek out practice supervisors to support their learning and encourage feedback to be recorded in their pads. Ideally though, students shouldn't be hunting around trying to find practice supervisors. This should be sorted out and arranged at the beginning of the placement so that the student can sort out their shifts with their practice supervisors. And the student needs to be aware of who their nominated practice assessor and academic assessor is from the beginning of the placement. These are the roles as in the Nursing Midwifery Council standards on their website. I'm just going to go over the practice supervisor roles, and the NMC say that the practice supervisor should be a role model of good practice. You should support learning in line with your scope of practice to enable the student to meet proficiencies and outcomes. Some practitioners get confused with what your scope of practice is. Essentially, it is what you are competent and skilled in doing in your workplace. So an example could be that you are newly qualified and it's your first job, and your scope of practice therefore may be a bit narrower than, say, somebody who has been working in the same work area for 5 years, because they've got extended roles and they have maybe some specialist areas of their practice. However, generally, most student outcomes, particularly in the first and second years, are quite general, and you should, as a practitioner be able to support the students to meet proficiencies and outcomes in those areas. If you feel you've got a third year student and you can't meet these, then you need to be having conversations with your team of supervisors to see who's most appropriate to support that student. Provide feedback on progress, and in order to do that, you need to have current knowledge and some experience in the area of practice. Obviously, though, you need to work out a way of giving feedback to that student. And we are really saying you need to write it down. You need to take the time somewhere towards the end of the shift. If you're not seeing that student again for another week or so, you need to give the student some feedback. And the students will be very, very keen to get that feedback. Contribute to the student's record of achievement by filling in that feedback and recommending the student if they have achieved some of their proficiencies. So you contribute to the assessment by doing that. And you're going to share the relevant observations that you have made of the student with the practice assessor and academic assessor through the practice assessment document. And if you've got any concerns with the student, you need to raise them with the practice assessor and/or the link lecturer as appropriate. Academic assessors with Oxford Brook are based within the university, and they're there to confirm the students' achievement of proficiencies and programme outcomes in the academic environment. So they will be basing their decisions on the student's practice assessment document that has been completed. And they need to have an understanding of the student's learning and achievement in practice. Now, these may well be link lecturers that are coming out, but when they come out as link lecturers, that is their role, link lecturer. They are not there as academic assessors, so they are not assessing the student in practice. You are as a practice assessor and practice supervisor. In summary then, practice supervisors may supervise different students, and you may have several different practice supervisors as a student for one placement, and that can include other healthcare professionals. Practice assessors may supervise other students, but you can't, as a practice assessor, supervise the same student, and get asked all the time about, well, if I'm a practice assessor, does that mean the student can't work with me? You can work as a practice assessor with the student, but you are not supervising them, you are assessing them. Each student will have an allocated practice assessor for the placement, and each student will have an academic assessor for each part of the programme. Practice supervisors cannot be a practice assessor for the same student at the same time. That's the summary, and you are directed in the workshop materials towards the resources, and here are some of the links on there. The Southpad for Nursing is a LibGuide site that has the latest templates on it. Remember, for nursing students, the BPAD, the electronic pad, will be there at Oxford Brookes for them. Some references that were used, and you know that some of the activities that are based from the workshop are using the Pan London Practice Learning Group site that have also developed the resources for their area.